Hey, it's Jordan Drake here in the beautiful city of Toronto, and what brings me here is that DJI has just released their brand new Pocket 4P. But this is way more than what we were expecting, which is just a Pocket 4 with a second lens on it. They're making some massive claims, including 17 stops of dynamic range on this little pocket camera. I'm going to be totally honest, I'm a little bit skeptical, but I'm glad I've got this beautiful location to run some extensive testing. And I should mention, DJI has flown us out here, set us up in a hotel. However, they have no editorial input in this video, and they don't get to see it before it's published. I'm Jordan Drake, this is PetaPixel. We got to check this camera out. Now, one of the great things about this trip is, aside from like this kind of gorgeous B-roll, everything that we're going to shoot on this trip is going to be captured with the Pocket 4P, because I have one and Chris has one as well.
There we go, and I'm going to be behind the camera for a lot of this today shooting Jordan, but before we get to that, I do want to thank our sponsor, KEH.com. You know, we're here in Toronto for this event, and that's because DJI, well, you just can't get them in the States anymore, sadly, but we were just recently in Atlanta, Georgia, the home of KEH, and what really blows me away is how much video gear they have. I mean, you've got cameras, you do definitely have older DJI products, but you've got lighting, microphones, all the accessories you need to make fantastic videos. So use their excellent search engine, find the video equipment you're looking for. You're gonna get to see the condition that everything's in, and they always have a generous return policy if you have buyer's remorse. You get to purchase pre-owned gear with peace of mind. They're PetaPixel's official pre-owned camera gear partner. All right, back to Jordan.
Oh. Now, obviously the major change on this compared to the Pocket 4 is this is now a dual camera system, but what really surprises me is I would actually say the main camera is the most interesting of the two. And just like what we had before in the Pocket 4, it's a 20mm equivalent lens with a Type 1 sensor on it, but what's really compelling is they've moved it over to a low-fix style of sensor. And there's a whole bunch of technical stuff we're not going to get into, but what you need to know is that means expanded dynamic range. Now, DJI is saying 17 stops, which would put it more with like above what a Hasselblad camera can record photographically, and in line with something like an Arri Alexa 35, which is tens of thousands of dollars. So I got to be honest, I'm a little bit skeptical. But there's also a new 3x camera. So while the main camera is 20mm, which is great for doing tracking shots and a lot of your classic gimbal shots, Chris has now switched over to the new 3x camera. This gives you a 60mm equivalent, which is a little bit more in the portrait range kind of focal length, and it'll give you a very different look. But one thing to remember here is you are moving over to a smaller sensor. This is a Type 1 over 1.28 sensor, and it does have quite a fast lens. It's an f1.8, but it does mean we're going to see a little bit less dynamic range in this mode. But look, it is a crazy contrasty day out here in Toronto. It's a perfect opportunity to get some more test footage. So let's go record that now, and we'll see you tomorrow with some of our findings. All right, it's day 2 here in Toronto, and it occurs to me this would be a great time to talk about what this camera actually is. So the entire Pocket series have always referred to small handheld cameras with a built-in gimbal. So you'll get extremely smooth footage. Even though smartphone stabilization has gotten excellent over the last few years, this is still quite a bit more effective, especially if you want to shoot at slower shutter speeds. The Pocket 4P also includes the upgrades that we saw to the active track system in the Pocket 4. And basically this means that the focus and the gimbal head is going to continue to track an object. And unlike what we saw in some of the previous models where it would very easily be distracted by subjects moving behind or especially in front of your subject, now it does a much better job at actually hanging on, as you can see in this example here. We also have some of the other improvements to the 4, like a couple of new custom function buttons. which aren't terribly customizable, unfortunately. And we also get over 100 gigabytes of internal memory, which is going to be incredibly useful if you want to just grab this and go. So the gimbals on these are incredibly effective for handling things like roll, little bounces, but if there's large vertical movement, you will still see quite a bit of that in the shot. Now, the major upgrade to the gimbal itself that we saw in the Pocket 4 is right on the back here. We've got this mounting point that's going to allow us to put lights, other accessories on there, and give you a really handy storage for your microphone. That has carried on to the new Pocket 4 Pro here. But what I'd love to see is a technology that DJI has in their drones where it'll flip the entire array for vertical shooting, so you can still shoot at full resolution. That's not available on this. It just doesn't have enough movement. So instead, it has to actually crop the video image, which drops your resolution from 4K down to 3K. Why did you want me to stand here?
What? Nothing. I don't want you to stand here. Why would I want you to stand here?
Now, one feature that is brand new that we didn't see before on the Pocket 4 is their new D-Log 2 profile. And this is necessary if you want to take advantage of all the dynamic range available in the main camera. This is very important. D-Log 2 is only available using the 20mm equivalent lens, which has the most dynamic range. But that brings me to one of the biggest frustrations with this camera, which is that if I want to switch over to the 3x lens, it's not just going to say switching to 3x, changing my log mode. No, I need to go into the menus, switch from D-Log 2 to D-Log 1, which also has a different base native ISO. So I want to change that ISO. If we're shooting D-Log 2, it's 100. If we go to original D-Log, base is 400 ISO. Making this even more complicated is the fact the built-in screen isn't going to give you a histogram. If you want to be able to meter your shot, you got to pull out your phone, you've got to set up the app, turn histograms on, and you can check your clipping point. But it gets even more complicated because your clipping point is different in D-Log 1 and D-Log 2. Needless to say, manually metering with this camera is a huge pain in the ass. I think the 3x lens is going to be very accessible if you want to shoot in full auto with standard profiles, but if you want to be more creative, this entire process is going to slow you down constantly, and it's driving me crazy.
Okay guys, so I know Jordan gets quite heated there, but I thought I'd give my more calming, perspective on things, my more relaxed, laid back perspective, because I've been using the camera too. Jordan's the host here, and I'm, recording a lot of this footage of him and looking at the movements and stuff, and I do find that the touchscreen's not always responsive. Like sometimes I'm trying to flick the screen to go to manual exposure, but it doesn't do it the first time, so I have to do it a second time, and sometimes flicking upwards, I'm actually clicking the 3x telephoto, and I don't want to do that either. And then really, now come to think about it, when I want to change manual exposure, like going back and forth between the two lenses, I'm finding that frustrating as well, because like the exposure changes on the screen, that's annoying, and then like I got to go into a menu and then into a sub-menu to change exposure, and that's actually like really slowing me down. And then now that I think about it more, it's actually making me angry, because Jordan talked about those custom buttons, but I can only do limited stuff like reset the gimbal and things like that, but there's no way to customize it, like go right into the manual exposure screen. That'd be really nice, but I can't do that. So that really slows me down, which makes me really want to just avoid exposing manually on this camera altogether. But then what's the point of having 17 stops of dynamic range if you can't expose properly to maximize it, which you have to. So really this is just great for like people on auto mode, but that's not a, so okay, I'm mad too.
Oh, hey there, sorry to interrupt. It's future Jordan here, and I've done a few more tests and reviewed a bit more footage, and I want to talk about that a little bit. So I've actually stored all of that on this new Glyph EX80 SSD. Now, this is a super fast drive, writes up to 7,000 megabytes per second, and I really like that it's got a tracker built in it, which works with Apple's Find My. When storage is as expensive as it is these days, it's important to maximize your value, so you should definitely check this out. Just click the link in the description below to learn more. And let's talk about my findings a little bit, starting with overheating. Now, the design of these is really nice for thermals because it keeps the sensor away from the rest of the camera body. And recording in its D-Log 2 profile, 4K up to 60 frames per second, I found that at room temperature, thermals were never a problem. I was able to record over 2 hours until the battery died with no warnings on overheating. The only time you can run into issues is if you're doing slow motion recording. When I went over to 4K 120p, I was able to record 23 minutes of continuous footage before the camera overheated and shut down. And in the most demanding 4K 240 frame per second mode, there I was able to get 13.5 minutes before the same thing happened. So in normal conditions, I don't think you'll have any issues with overheating on this in the standard record modes. Just remember that slow motion can give you some problems with thermals. The other thing I'd really like to touch on is the dramatic difference between the footage that I captured with D-Log 2 and the original D-Log. When I was switching between the two cameras, I found the difference was really dramatic, so I wouldn't really recommend cross-cutting between D-Log 2 shot on the Type 1 camera and the original D-Log shot on the 3x camera. Okay, thank you for your patience with my quick digressions, and now back over to Chris in Toronto.
So of course, traveling a new city is always great, but meeting the people in that city is even better. I love when people come up and say, hey, I watched the show. And we got Froggy here. He comes up, he's like, hey, you guys.
I recognize these guys.
Yeah, and it's so great to meet people, but this is even better because we were talking about getting like some action, maybe some sports, some sort of movement for the camera test.
And I happen to have a skateboard, so I'm like, Chris, why don't you take some shots of me skating around?
Very generous of you. Thanks for giving us your lunch break. I know you don't have much time, but
no problem.
Froggy's going to show us around Toronto a little bit. Let's get some shots.
Chris's first time in Toronto, so I'm like, let me show you the spots. We're in Chinatown right now. I'm going to show them Kensington, and we'll just shoot around, do some shots.
Awesome. Let's get to it.
Now, slow motion is one reason you may be looking at the Pocket 4 and Pocket 4P, because one of the headline features is the ability to record 4K up to 240 frames per second with the main camera. And I really love the detail that we're getting out of this slow motion. A lot of the time when you see these very high frame rates, it's just very soft, covered in aliasing, but that is not the case here. One real downside though is you can't use your log profiles when you're shooting slow motion video. So you do get a little bit of an over-sharpened, very saturated look to the footage. I mean, it looks good, it just means you're not gonna have that much room to play with it in post. It's also important to remember, if you jump over to the 3x lens, then you're gonna be capped at 200 frames per second. Not a big deal, but I wish it would just automatically jump to 200 frames instead of making me go to the menus and select slow motion recording 200 frames per second back to the 3x camera. Again, it's just a little bit fiddly. Okay, so there's a location I've always wanted to shoot. It's here at the Rivoli, but they're not gonna let us film in there, so I don't know, I feel like we need to come up with some sort of plan to get in. I mean, while all these beautiful songs are playing in the background, it's a good time to talk about audio, and this is something I really like about the entire Osmo series is they'll directly communicate with DJI's microphones. So you can run a couple of these in and it'll stereo split the audio in your clip. But also, if you're just using the internal audio, it's actually not bad. All right, here's the quality of the built-in microphone out of the wind. I mean, it's not great, it's not bad, it's, you know, it's usable. It's fairly good at isolating dialogue, things like that. I wouldn't use it for live music or anything like that, but in a pinch, if you forget a microphone, it does a pretty good job. All right, we've done quite a bit of extensive testing with the Pocket 4P, and it's time to talk about the borderline ridiculous claim that DJI made, giving this camera 17 stops of dynamic range. Well, I've done some testing, and the dynamic range on this camera is actually pretty good. We use this camera in its new D-Log 2 profile, which is required if you want to get the most dynamic range out of it, and compared it to a Panasonic S1 II full-frame camera in dynamic range boost mode, which is some of the best dynamic range I've ever gotten out of a camera. And looking at the two side by side, you can see highlight retention when you expose them as bright as possible without clipping, very similar in these two examples. And if we look at the shadows in these deep dark blacks here, honestly, noise levels are pretty similar. Now, the Panasonic is rated at 15 stops of dynamic range. I'm not getting the impression that this is 2 stops better. I think it's a very similar image coming out of it, but still, 15 stops of usable dynamic range out of a Type 1 sensor is an incredibly impressive accomplishment. Now, one other comparison I wanted to do is compare this to the original Pocket 4, which has the same size sensor but not low-fic. How much benefit are we actually seeing there? So we shot this incredibly bright highlight right at the top of the TD building, and you can see we still get detail when we're looking at the Pocket 4P, where the highlights are clipped in the original Pocket 4. So yes, there is definitely a highlight benefit to this new sensor, and it's extremely impressive. So another thing I was very curious about is low light performance on this. Sometimes when we see really good base ISO performance, we actually suffer in the higher ISOs. Here again, I was relatively impressed. I actually compared this to the original Pocket 4, and you can see it's very similar levels of detail, but a little bit less noise in the Pocket 4P, whether we're shooting at very high ISOs. This is 6400 ISO in the original log profile, comparing the two, or if we shoot in the night mode. Now here it's doing some frame blending, so it means at 4K, you're gonna be maxed out at 30 frames per second. But this does give you a real benefit in terms of letting you shoot in low light, hanging on to highlights, but it's not gonna let you use the log profiles for more grading. What you see is what you get. So we've had a good amount of time to shoot with the new Pocket 4P. And my final take on this is it's actually a bit of a confusing camera. I find it a really valuable technical demonstration of what these new low-fic sensors are capable of doing, because the image quality on this is truly excellent. The dynamic range, the slow motion, even the low light performance is really compelling on this. My major concern is that if you're a more advanced user who's really going to appreciate that, you're going to find the experience of using this quite frustrating, cycling between your different log profiles, not being able to see a histogram without pulling your phone out. And the fact that if you're taking advantage of the great dynamic range on the main camera, there's no way to very quickly switch over to the 3x camera and keep recording log footage. But that's what's so confusing about this camera is it really feels like it operates best if you're just going to use some of the default standard profiles and use it in auto exposure mode. But this is a pretty expensive product to be doing that. Well, the time has come for us to leave this beautiful Toronto skyline, but I did have a lot of fun with the DJI Pocket 4P, but there's still a lot I want to talk about with Chris and Jaron, and where you're going to find that is on the PetaPixel podcast. You can watch it right here on this exact same YouTube channel, or give it a listen on all your favorite podcasting apps. Just search for the PetaPixel podcast. But I guess it's time for us to head back to Calgary. I'm going to miss it, but stay tuned for a lot more episodes right here on PetaPixel. Damn, we never filmed in the Rivoli.